one of the things I've tried to tell people about the Maine wire story, about that finding, were people going out the back door with bags full of money? No, we did not find that. But nonetheless, it's a risk. It's a risk. And they weren't documenting things properly. They weren't following procedures completely, or in some cases at all. So, what we come out with is the result is that you had we did 45 contracts, some of which were sole sourced, and we didn't see documentation for that type of review. That's something, again, they can fix that, right? They can go forward and fix that.
State Auditor Matt Dunlap, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So we have to start right off the top. You are, I think, mulling, floating, and considering, according to the headlines, a run for Congress in Maine's 2nd Congressional District. I consider mulling to be less official than considering or exploring. So where on the spectrum from mulling to exploring would you be?
Well, thankfully, I think everyone has forgotten my star-crossed Senate campaign from 2012, although it wasn't a bad idea. I remember I was out of office. I was working for the Sportsman's Alliance of Maine, but I kind of kept my finger on the pulse of what was going on. And it all kind of came together in my head, and I realized that Olympia Snowe had a good chance of losing a primary, and that somebody should step up and, offer themselves forward, which I did. It was a great idea until she dropped out. And then, of course, Angus King got in the race. And Angus King, he is masterful. He can talk a hungry wolf away from a bowl of hamburger. And everything just kind of stopped. Fundraising, I think my fundraising goal was like $12,000 a day. And there was one day I raised like $50. And I think somebody felt sorry for me. But when I was starting to think about that, I wanted to make sure I wasn't, looking at things one-dimensionally. So I remember talking to some of my very close associates. And I said, well, what do you think? And 3 of them all said the exact same thing. Really? And so people have talked to me about this for quite a while. And, I always kind of brushed it off. But in the last, especially 3-4 years, things have gotten kind of at a fever pitch with things happening in Congress and the tenor of our own representation. And I started kind of thinking about that and before I actually put together a campaign, which there's a lot of mechanics that go into that. You have to have a website, you have to have a bank account, you have to have compliance stuff, you have to have office equipment. There's a lot you have to do to build a campaign before you say I'm running. I remember there was a fellow who ran for Congress 20 years ago who was a dairy farmer, and he had his press conference in his dairy barn. They said, so what's your website? Well, I don't have that yet. I said, position papers? I'm working on those. I said, so what is it you're really announcing?
Yeah.
So I talked it over with some folks. I said, look, there's no harm in exploring the idea and doing that publicly. Just say, look, I'm thinking about running. What do people think? And frankly, the response has been almost overwhelmingly positive. So that's been gratifying. Now I have to think about a timeline, and of course, family comes into this too. You don't run alone, and it takes a toll on families. So I'm talking it over with my wife and my daughter and my siblings and see how they feel about all this. And I don't really have a timeline per se, but what I have said right along is look, I've got a lot of experience and I have a lot of knowledge. And these are dangerous times. And I don't care who's in office, whether you're talking about the president, the past president, but you have a war in Europe, you have a war in the Middle East, you have potential for war in Asia. Things are tough with the economy, and I think we should be working for better prosperity and peace. So that's what I'm going to be talking to folks about.
Well, I think you've caused some heartburn amongst Democrats for sure, because they don't want to consider a challenge to an incumbent. Have you talked with Congressman Golden about this?
I have not. Timing is always an issue there, and of course there's certain things, there are strategies involved, right? And you have to be careful what you say and when you say it and to whom you say it. I remember when Steve Rowe made it known that he was going to run for Attorney General, an hour later I got a call from Drew Ketterer saying, hey, it was great to see you today, forgot to ask for your commitment. So you don't want to step in your own bear trap. So I haven't announced anything, so there's nothing to really declare. I suspect we will talk at some point, and hopefully it's cordial. So.
So I guess was any part of this based on, I guess, reading the tea leaves, because I think a lot of people are expecting Golden to run for governor, maybe independent, maybe in the Democratic primary. But he's openly said he doesn't like D.C. He thinks it's his last term. So it's not wild-eyed speculation to say that maybe that seat's going to be open.
Yeah, no, people have talked to me about a lot of things, and there's speculation about Susan Collins too. That I think everybody expects her to run again, but is she going to face a primary? And that, I think, opens up different.
Well, she is. There is a declared candidate.
Well, I mean, I don't think Susan Collins has much to fear at this point. Sarah Gideon spent $102 million against her and got 43%. So her vulnerability is to the right, for sure. But likewise, the race for governor is going to be wide open. And I certainly understand my own party dynamic, which, thinking about a statewide campaign, first of all, let me just be very plain. I love my job. I don't want to leave my job, but the reality is that when you hear that knock on the front door of opportunity, if you don't respond, you'll be left behind. And so there has been talk about Congressman Golden running for governor. I hear different things about that, and I decided not to let other circumstances dictate what I was considering doing. So in a way, there was some tea leaves about what could happen, but also just forging ahead on my own map with that my own dynamic was really what got me to go this far, and we'll see how much farther it goes.
Okay. Well, you mentioned your current job, which you love. You're the state auditor, one of the, I would say, the lesser known of the constitutional officers, but the constitutional officer spot is not unfamiliar to you. I think you were the Secretary of State for, most of my life.
Yeah, 14 years.
Well, yeah. Well, you were the longest serving Secretary of State for the state of Maine for my entire life.
Yeah.
I remember you on my first driver's license, not to date anybody here.
Hopefully I wasn't on your first suspension letter either.
But you guys released a report. The State Auditor's Office outlined in the Constitution. You released an annual report. The Department of Administrative and Financial Services, they put out their financial report. You guys comb through it. You send them your feedback. They respond to you, or the various agencies that you've audited respond to you. This year, the audit got a little increased attention, I think, because of me.
Yeah.
I found it to be sensational. I thought that the findings were pretty remarkable, and you kind of have to read between the lines a little bit because of the way an auditor writes. There's a standard language for an audit where you use these phrases like material weakness and significant deficiency.
And what does that mean?
And so I guess I thought it was sensational, and my headline was $2.1 billion in 2024 spending at risk for fraud and corruption. The pushback, I think, from defenders of the Mills administration, defenders of Kirsten Figueroa, Democrats broadly, has been that you didn't march anybody out in handcuffs.
Yeah.
Basically, so the audit for them is just no big deal, no news at all. And you were in front of the State and Local Government Committee to talk about the role of the state auditor. And I think that there were some questions people had about the audit, and you signaled your willingness to talk about those questions, and then were shut down pretty abruptly, I thought.
Yeah, and you're right. The language of audit is incredibly understated. And from my background, because I did a master's degree in literature, where you try to make things as vivid as possible, it's been an adjustment that way. You don't talk about blood splatter in an audit. You talk about risk, and and really, fundamentally, the purpose of an audit is to help an organization improve its process. There's a lot of different types of audits, and I think people, when they hear the word audit, their first emotional response is usually fear. IRS tax audits. Of course, we don't do those, and those are probably some of the easier ones to do. It's like you've claimed an exemption. Are you eligible? It's black and white. We do financial audits. As you mentioned, the annual comprehensive financial report. We go through that, and because really, people want to be able to believe what they're reading, and that's what an audit provides you. That there's reasonable assurance that this is accurate. It's not perfect, not absolute assurance, but reasonable assurance. But the other biggest part of what we do is the compliance audit. There's billions of dollars worth of federal money that comes down from a whole host of federal agencies. And at one time, they all had their own audit mechanisms. And of course, then Congress intervened in the 80s and passed the Single Audit Act, which provided for a single clearinghouse for all of it to go. And that's what we do. That is the lion's share of our work. And we audit all the major programs. Some of them we do every year, some we do on a rotating basis. We rotate auditors so they have a fresh set of eyes on things like Medicaid, for example. And you know, it's a straight matching up of what the criteria is for spending that money versus what they've actually done. And you know, people do make mistakes. Sometimes they don't know what they're supposed to be working on. And you point that out sometimes in a very low-key way. The management letter is like, well, you know, we can't not mention this, but it's not something that rises to the level of a finding. You know, that type of thing. And then, of course, you have control deficiencies, control weaknesses, and then the significant deficiencies, material weaknesses, material non-compliance, question costs. These are all big deals. And you know, one of the things I've tried to tell people about the Maine wire story, about that finding, were people going out the back door with bags full of money? No, we did not find that. But nonetheless, it's a risk. It's a risk. And, you know, they weren't documenting things properly. They weren't following procedures completely or in some cases at all. And that's something they should work on. Now, what's happened here in many cases is that there's been a lot of circling of wagons, and not peculiar to this audit or this public scrutiny, but generally speaking, when we do this work, and the years now that I've done it, we say in the office, we say, look, if agencies actually followed our recommendations and spent less time arguing with us, they'd put us out of business, you know, and in some circumstances, I mean, agencies really truly do their best. You know, you have some agencies with very high vacancy rates. They just don't have the people to do the work.
Yes, auditors, I think, are one of the highest unfilled positions, or I guess the most frequently occurring unfilled position in state government right now.
Yeah, it's tough work. Many agencies have their own audit functions. Like when I was Secretary of State, we had auditors who would do mostly the municipal finance side. We have, you know, town clerks are agents of the Secretary of State. When people go to register their vehicle, we audit that work to make sure that they're following all the rules and that we're actually collecting all the money that's due to us. And many agencies have that. You know, our work is a little bit more broad. It's not quite as focused as some of those other audit offices, but it can be grueling work, and it's hard to find qualified people to do that. And this is another circumstance that's not only facing state government, but municipal government is really suffering out there, because you have fewer people getting into the fields of accounting and auditing now than at any time in American history.
Well, it's easier to be an Instagram influencer.
That's what people want, you know, in all seriousness, because I was a commercial cook for 20 years. And I was talking to this fellow at Eastern Maine Community College, who's retired now, but he was head of the culinary program. Fabulous culinary program. I'd say it would be better than Johnson and Wales, but that's because I worked with some of these people, and they're curious, they're energetic, they know all the basics, they're great hires for restaurants. And he told me that, you know, they have a different kind of student now. He said, used to be we had kids coming in and wanted to have their own restaurant or go to a big culinary academy, or you know, like Cordon Bleu in Paris, or you know, the Roux Brothers or Culinary Institute of America. Not anymore. He said what they want to have now is their own TV show, you know, or
a YouTube channel.
Or a YouTube channel. Yeah, it's a different.
No one gets a YouTube channel with auditing, you know, going deep into audit.
We were laughing about The Pit, you know, the emergency room drama. And it's like, what if we did a drama about auditing? It would be on the sleep.
I think it would flop.
Yeah, it'd be on the Sleep channel. But you know,
which is not to say that the findings of your report weren't, I think, dramatic and newsworthy. I guess, how would you react to the way it's been received at the State House and by the governor as a taxpayer and as a voter, not as a, you know, someone whose name is on the report?
Well, I think there's a lot of education that has to happen there. You know, again, the standard line has been, this happens all the time. It's every year. This is not a big deal. There's nothing to see.
Which doesn't necessarily, there's a lot of stuff that happens every year.
Sure.
Doesn't necessarily mean that it's not newsworthy and sensational.
You know, well, one of the things that has come up is that there's been more findings in our audits of the Mills administration than there were in the LePage administration, which is true, except they had all the COVID money that hit, you know, and that, because I was Secretary of State when the COVID money hit. And not so much the money, the rules don't change with the money, but the rule book kind of went out the window.
Yeah.
When, you know, when we were trying to figure out how people could register their cars when the town offices were closed. You know, how do you run a statewide election in the grip of a global pandemic? And in fact, at one point early on, we were talking about having an all absentee ballot election. And Julie Flynn, who's still the deputy over there, who's probably forgotten more about elections than anyone in the country will ever know, she called me. I woke up at 3 in the morning in a panic. She said, who's going to issue the absentee ballots if all the town offices are closed? We don't issue them. The towns issue them. So, that was a lot of challenges to overcome. And sometimes, you had to improvise a little bit. But we've talked about with federal criteria for spending funds, I mean, they don't change their rules very easily. And, it's up to them to make the decision whether, an adjustment is something they need to worry about or not. It's like I've told everyone in this, our job is to be picky. We're the proofreaders, if you will, because I was a proofreader for 10 years. If you look at all my work experiences, yes, I'm 60 years old. I do have about 75 years worth of work experience, but many times I was working 2 and 3 jobs at a time. So that's how that all adds up. But, when I learned how to be a proofreader, the woman who trained me said, you have to be very picky. If you're not sure if that should be a semicolon or a comma, you circle it and you ask. That's what we do. It's like, okay, they did a sole source contract kind of after the fact, we pointed out it's up to the federal clearinghouse to say whether or not they can live with that or not. But if we don't point it out, then we're going to go under peer review this summer, and we have to do that every 3 years. We're going to have auditors from Missouri and I think South Carolina in the office going over our processes. And we had our first one that under my watch 3 years ago was one of our best ones ever because we have a great crew. But if you do things like look the other way or decide something's not a big deal, your peer review will be really bad. And that affects your ability to continue as an organization. It could force the state to contract out for about 4 or 5 times the cost. So we take our work pretty seriously, and we try to make sure we do a good job and it's of service to the agencies that we work with.
I think there was particular interest in the no-bid contract aspect. Certainly there was for me, having read it and reported on it, because these are instances where inherently there's less accountability when a no-bid contract is assigned. There's no competitive free market process to work to lower the price, so you have no idea how a price was settled upon. And the explanations in some instances really don't pass the straight face test for some of these. So could you talk a little bit about, I guess, what the audit said about no-bid contracts and some of the processes that were involved, or I guess the processes that you guys flagged?
Yeah, review more than anything. Maybe they did a review, but they didn't document it, which is important.
So when you say they, who's supposed to be reviewing?
The chief procurement officer. In fact, there's a number of job descriptions within procurement that have reviewing things like contract proposals and proposals for sole source contracts in their job descriptions. But if they were doing it, they didn't document it, which is, you can't really audit something that's not there. So I have a little experience with this. So going back to the days of my old job, as we were trying to get ranked choice voting off the ground as a voting mechanism, we had a contract with a vendor, Election Systems and Software out of Nebraska. They do all the tabulating machines. And they also had a high-speed tabulator that we could lease where, you go to the polls, you mark your ballot, you put it in the thing, it sucks it in, and then the little dial goes around and says, thank you for voting. The high-speed tabulator can do a whole town in about 5 minutes, so it's a much better piece of technology, very expensive. So it seemed to make sense to us that if we had to write an algorithm to sort for the rankings, that they would do that work. And of course, there was going to be a contract, there's going to be way more than $5,000. And we made a request for a sole source contract with them, and we had to justify that and walk through fire for a couple of weeks before they would say, yeah, okay, you're right, that probably does make sense to have them do it rather than another vendor who's not familiar with their technology, which would take the image of the ballot and then do the rankings. So, so those were reviews that if they were happening, we didn't have documentation of them. And for
is it feasible that they could be happening without documentation?
I wouldn't think so, but I wouldn't judge that from afar.
Yeah.
The people that were working in the field know better. That's in the work papers. Work papers are always confidential. So what we come out with is the result is that you had we did 45 contracts, some of which were sole sourced, and we didn't see documentation for that type of review. That's something, again, they can fix that, right? They can go forward and fix that. there was a blend of state and federal money involved. We didn't do a question cost because of the state money. State agencies have complete hegemony over state money, so we don't usually involve question costs. When you see a question cost, it's usually because it's all federal money. So there's a lot of nuances to all that are not immediately apparent to the reader, but it's the audit is for the use of the agency. It's public, obviously. It's like when you do a town audit. We don't do town audits anymore, but we post those so that people can. We get a complaint about something happening in town office. First thing I do is I pull the audit and see if there are any deficiencies, and if I find them, I say, well, you got to talk to the select board about this because this is where your concern emanates from. So it's a useful document. And yeah, $2.1 billion was not going out the back door in a Brinks truck, but
which I don't think anyone ever really claimed.
No,
it was
but
just at risk if there's no strong controls.
But what I said over and over again is like, that said, these are serious findings,
yeah.
And they do bear attention, and people should pay attention to that.
Well, also I think people look at some of the texture as opposed to the numbers of these stories. Like you have, Bill Longfellow, the former director of the Bureau of General Services, gave a contract to his brother's landscaping firm. They said he recused, maybe he did. He signed the contract and he resigned after we reported on it. He's at the head of the bureau that's supposed to be, I guess, the Office of State Procurement Services is under the Bureau of General Services. It's kind of like, a foreign language to most people who work at the private sector, but the guy who's the boss of big HR, who's supposed to be the cop on the beat, signs a contract to his brother's landscaping firm. Yeah. And then you hear about some of these other, or in my case, you see some of these other no-bid contracts, like to, Senator Rachel Talbot Ross's sister's nonprofit. They're getting a no-bid contract. To the former director of the Office of New Americans, who's had to resign now because of his anti-Armenian posts, he gets a no-bid contract. It's like they're being handed out in a way that seems politically calculated.
Yeah,
which adds another layer of scrutiny, one that you can't necessarily get into.
No, we don't
as an
weigh in
auditor,
on that.
But
it
makes people suspicious.
I've been in this business long enough to know that perception can be reality sometimes. If people believe something bad has happened, you might as well have something bad happening. I was on the board of directors of the Sportsmen's Alliance in Maine as Secretary of State when we got the appointment notice that the Bear referendum people were going to bring in their petitions. I didn't miss a beat. I sat right down. I wrote a letter of resignation. Now, to the board, and I don't actually sort through all the signatures. I don't disqualify signatures. I don't do any of that work. And really all I do is sign the final declaration, whether or not they make it. But if I'm the Secretary of State who is overseeing a process to get a ballot question on the ballot and say they don't make it, and I'm on the board of SAM, how do people feel about that? They're going to think of fixes in whether there is or not. And I think that's something that people have to be very, very wary of in this business is, you can't even have the appearance of impropriety. Maybe these people did nothing wrong, but you resign even if it wasn't your fault because people are going to always mark you with that. One of my colleagues when I was secretary was the Secretary of State in Pennsylvania, and they had an important constitutional amendment that failed to get on the ballot because someone in her office did not do the public notice in time. Now, she was appointed by the governor, not elected by the legislature or by the general public. First thing she did was she resigned because someone had to step down. Mm-hmm. And it's a tough place to be when you're in that situation. I think really the best antidote to that is not get in the situation in the first place. So, I can't speak to people resigning from these positions because of the audit, other than, it's something that can happen. And like we said, in the finding, if one of the risks here is that the state could be liable to litigation and up to and including paying the full value of a contract to someone who didn't get the opportunity to bid on it. Of course, that happened in court. That's, you don't know how those things are going to turn out. But having been in court a lot of times because of my professional decisions, I can tell you it can be a very, very uncertain process. You never know how a judge is going to rule.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point you make about being cautious or respectful of people's feelings or people's impression, even if they're not grounded in fact, like with your resignation from SAM. I want to get back to that in a little bit, but specifically on the audit and the no-bid contracts, you said that there were 45 contracts that you guys sampled?
That was a sample.
So
non-statistical random sample.
So what's the universe of potential contracts. Like
Yeah.
how many contracts did they have active? Does the state have? I'm sure they've got that number handy for you.
Well, somewhere. I don't have it on my head. There is a formula for drawing these samples. You do look at a population. Of course, if you remember statistics, I took statistics in college. I got a B+. I don't know why, because I didn't really understand anything we did other than how it's a preponderance that you're more likely to get heads in a coin toss than tails for some scientific reason. But when you do that sampling, there is a diminishing return. I mean, sometimes a larger sample doesn't tell you much more. If say there's 20,000 contracts, pulling 1,000 contracts doesn't tell you more than the 45. So there is a formula for that. And we can probably find out exactly how many contracts there are because they're all through state government. But that series of contracts was worth, I think, just under $8 million, which is a significant amount of money. One of the things that I promised myself when I was first elected to the Maine legislature in 1996, I said, you get caught in this whirlwind. And I thought, okay, how do I stay grounded? And I thought one of the ways I stayed grounded was that the day I thought $1,000 was not a lot of money was the day I should leave office.
Yeah.
And I still
Funny,
believe,
I was just thinking 8 million is kind of like a rounding error for the budget these days.
well, it is, but just to back out of that for a second, we did a fraud investigation a couple of years ago that did make the press, and it involved a procurement card.
So, yeah, it was the credit card. Wasn't out in Washington County?
No, it was actually at the Charleston Correctional.
Oh, yes, okay.
The deputy superintendent was alleged, still has not gone to trial, to be using that card to make fake purchases with an accomplice in another state who was then kicking back money to him via PayPal. And we had a new auditor. It's like, hey, let's look at procurement cards. Now, procurement cards are sort of the electronic version of petty cash, right?
Mm-hmm.
You used to have the cigar box right under the counter. But now we don't do petty cash anymore. You have the P card. And how do you use a P card? Well, when I was Secretary of State, we'd host the parent-student mock election over at the Armory. And we'd send somebody to Little Caesars with a P card, buy a bunch of pizzas for the kids, $500 worth of pizzas. They don't have time to wait for a check after 2 months. They need to get paid, and it's below the RFP threshold. So we just use the P card, and the controller's office pays it every month. So we said to our guys, take a look at procurement cards. Well, there's hundreds of thousands of these transactions, but one card kept popping up, sometimes every other day, near the max of $4,999.99.
We call that stacking?
Well, it certainly caught our attention, and we dug into it. It's like, okay, what are the vendors? And what we found, long story short, fake websites, uncovered, a bunch of stuff. The Attorney General's office got involved, and they did, a deep investigation. They got search warrants and subpoenas and everything. So the fellow was taken away in handcuffs and is now, looking at some ultimate legal action. When that happened and the news broke, I told the staff, look, you're going to see people in the grocery store. When they ask you why we didn't catch this guy for 9 years, don't say it wasn't material. Mm-hmm. $2.5 to $4 million is plenty material for people who don't know how they're going to pay their heating oil bill.
Yeah.
So, again, just being respectful of the public, I always bear in mind, I keep a figure in my head, that all state expenditures in 1820 amounted to $1,329.91. The budget's grown a little bit.
Just a little, yeah.
But, when we were talking about that investigation, because you couldn't talk about it publicly, and I would work from home a couple of days a week. I go for a walk around town, and right on Main Street in Old Town is a food cupboard. Open a couple days a week, and I go by there's 60 people in line.
Yeah.
And I thought, these are taxpayers, and they are trusting us to keep track of this stuff. And the fact that this guy had taken a lengthy European vacation on the state's dime while these people are looking for canned beans, it kind of pissed me off. It makes you dig in that much harder.
Yeah, I think that's a good, that resentment or that territorialness of government spending or taxpayer money is a good feature to have in a state auditor.
I mean,
probably something you need as motivation, right?
Sure. Well, because I've never had a problem spending money on the public trust to do good things, and as long as you can rationalize it, justify it, and explain it, I think you're in good shape. And because one man's waste is another man's vital program, as we all know politically. But I mean, I think safeguarding, at least showing that we are keeping an eye on these things, is critically important to this process, and something I believe in. So I am very blessed to have dropped in amongst a group of people who are incredibly intelligent and kind and committed and not a little bit ferocious. When I started there, as you folks documented quite thoroughly, I had never taken a high school bookkeeping class, and it was really scary. Here I'm walking into this office, I'm the boss, right? And I've got an office full of CPAs, internal auditors, fraud examiners, information technology auditors, people with extraordinary backgrounds and educations. And I think they had all been forgiven for kind of looking at me sideways. And it's like, here we go, And as I would study after hours, I had all the study guides trying to keep this stuff in my head. And one of our folks was finishing up their CPA work. And she poked her head in the door and said, I had to take a literature class because I don't have a bachelor's degree. It's part of my stuff I had to do for the CPA. She said, I don't read. I hate this stuff. I just had my last test. I got 79 out of 80 right. And if I can do that, you can do this. I mean, they just cheered me on the whole way. And it really kept me afloat. And I can't remember her name, Erica, I think it was, who on your staff that reported on it. She was actually very humane and told a straight story and was actually very good to us. And, because part of my rule of engagement is that transparency is always your friend. Yeah, when I didn't make it, I thought, as awful as it is, I got to call my own shot. I can't have somebody else report it. So I sent the letter saying, and those were very, very hard days. And they were there for me, and they lifted me up. And of course, I did finally pass the exams. They're hard for a reason. And when I'm 110 years old and am blind and deaf, I am going to keep my CPEs going because I am never letting that certification go.
Has it made you better at doing your taxes?
Oh, I've learned so much. I mean, and it's elegant work. In terms of tax, oh yeah, I mean, it's weird. People ask me tax questions. I actually know the answers. I'm not an accountant. That may come next. I may actually do a CPA because I'm fascinated by it. Honestly, I wish I'd started at audit. I've learned so much about how government works and some of the origins of these programs along an organic timeline and the interplay between the federal, state, county, and municipal government actions. It's just fascinating work. And I learned 10 new things a day. Because I was learning new stuff every day when I was secretary too. And that's one of the great things about this kind of work is that if you're curious, you can learn anything.
So if you were not mulling a 2nd District congressional race and you were governor for a month, or a dictatorial governor, and you get to make some changes to bring the state into compliance and address all of these things that the audit has flagged, what would be your top 3, top 5 hit list?
Well, I'd say listen to the state auditor, first of all. I mean, we're not trying to hurt these agencies or we're not trying to embarrass people. We are trying to make things better, because I was one of the legislators that helped establish the Program Evaluation Office. Ed Youngblood was in the Senate, Dave Trahan and I were in the House together.
So this is OPEGA.
OPEGA. And, one of the things about term limits, that's one thing I would do is if I had it all under control myself, I'd get rid of term limits. It's been
They're a double-edged sword.
They're incredibly corrosive. We used to say that the tragedy of term limits is that by the time you really start to figure things out, you're gone. You can't say that anymore. People are terming out with no more of a clue how to do things than they did when they first got elected. You don't have the old timers who know the traditions and the process and how to get things done, mentoring anybody anymore. It's more like, how do I get my bill passed right now? And I watch committees and I watch sessions and it kind of makes me cringe a little bit. Just all kinds of little things that contribute a lot to the process are gone.
Well, it also strengthens the executive branch quite a bit when there's no counterbalance. Like if there's not a John Martin to your Paul LePage, then the legislature, I think, the legislative branch as a whole loses power relative to the executive branch.
The executive branch and also senior legislative staff who know just enough. They know more than the rank and file, and they can move things in ways that they couldn't when I was first in. So that's a major thing that I think harms the institution and harms the public ultimately. When I first got elected, I was on the Fish and Wildlife Committee. Bucky Owen was commissioner. He's a little bit embattled. And he came to my house. I actually had an apartment right by the paper mill in Old Town. And, because running for office is very different than serving. And he said, what do you have for ideas for legislation? And I said, well, I think I'd do something to help sportsmen. And I said, okay, what's that? Well, I thought I'll put a bill in to repeal the ban on Sunday hunting. And his face just kind of fell. And what I didn't realize is that somebody had that bill in every year since 1883 when it was first enacted. And it just never, and of course the public policy purposes have changed completely from then. And it's just an institution that we have to live with. But again, a new legislator doesn't know these things. And now we have new legislators who've been here for 8 years. Not a knock on them. These are people who care enough to run and they want to do good things. They just really lack the tools.
Or they lack the historical knowledge of what's already been attempted.
Yeah, and it's
the phenomenon of the zombie bill, the bill that just returns every single year in some form or fashion. Maybe sometimes there's 4 or 5 examples of a Sunday hunting repeal. Well,
and I think some of the reforms they've put in place around concept drafts. Concept drafts were very uncommon when I was there, and oftentimes we'd automatically carry over a concept draft. Okay, Steve, we understand you want to do this. Why don't you go work on this over the summer, come back with us something next spring? And of course, that just wasn't happening at all. And so now they have a reform that says if you don't bring an amendment within a certain amount of time, it is automatically defeated. Reported out ought not to pass. So automatic withdrawal, they call it.
Yeah.
And that's, again, a response to that sort of organic change. So.
Well, I think even that, the rule that they were trying to get advanced around concept drafts is a little squishy, and there's room to dance around it if you really want to.
Well, concept drafts do have a place. I had a strong hand in writing the state's lifetime hunting and fishing license law. That began as a concept draft. The department,
but you actually had a concept. You kind of knew what you wanted to do with it.
And we took a lot of time filling that in. We talked to every other state that did it. We came up with a very solid plan that has worked quite well. That's what a concept draft can do, but it's not just...
I'm sure the title of it wasn't like an act related to animals or something like that. It was probably a little more specific to what you actually were doing.
Yeah, and I think, again, as long as you're transparent, you can do many, many things. So.
Do you think that the way the state government accounts for spending is transparent enough?
No, I don't. And I'm speaking not as an auditor here, but as a common citizen. Most people do not know how to read the budget. They don't know what all the different accounts are. Like I tell people, we're 95% 014, which is other special revenue. Those are the fees we collect from agencies to do the audits. That's where our budget comes. We're not very small sliver of general fund money. But, part of that's politics. Back when I was in, the budget was broken into several pieces. You had the Part 1 budget, which is current services, Part 2, new and expanded services, and then you had the legislative appropriations table, you had the bond package, and then you had any supplemental budgets that you needed to do. But because the parties could not agree on a lot of this, and then because the whole business with the majority budgets, which began when I was in my first term, which is just 5 years after the big state shutdown, that's now become a regular feature of budget writing, is that you put the whole thing in one package, you don't let people pick and choose what they can vote for or against, and then if you are afraid of a shutdown, you do a majority budget. And I think that's going to be a regular feature of budgeting until we amend the Constitution to say that the budget takes effect on July 1st, regardless of when you pass it. And I've read the legislative record from 1991, and Democrats were completely flat-footed when that broke. And it was a well-reasoned plan by Senate Republican leadership with the cooperation of the governor. You don't dance alone, you got to have a partner, on the workers' comp issue. And by the time the Democrats realized they're completely over a barrel, there was nothing they could do, and they finally just had to concede to all the demands of the Republican caucuses. When I came in 96, we were going through a similar back and forth, and it was the threat for another shutdown was real, and then the Democrats figured it out. It's like, you pass a budget by March 31st, you adjourn without day, takes effect July 1st, there is no shutdown, thereby defanging that tool. And I think it's corrosive to relationships in the State House because, this is a relationship business. You get things done by working with people. So, I mean, but in terms of the transparency of the budget, it's gotten so detailed, it's hard for people to discern and understand. Moving through, accounts in different agencies, like technology, you have the Office of Information Technology, but then every agency has its own technology budget. They have their own technology people. It's very difficult, I think, for the public to follow. And I think, I don't know how you make that better, frankly.
Well, they created the transparency website. I think most people intersect with the state spending not by looking at the budget, but by looking at like Maine Open Checkbook, which, when Governor LePage came into office, then the Maine Heritage Policy Center did their transparency website, which involved Freedom of Access Act requests to all the different government agencies and the quasis and the authorities and whatever. And then they just published the data with a little tool so people could read it. Yeah. And when LePage came into office, he said, well, this should be a function of government, and created that website that the state now runs, but it's not updated. It's very poor. It's almost as if, if I was going to design a financial transparency website that made it harder to look at financial data, that's how I would design it. It's very, very difficult to use. And I would say the same thing for the state contract websites, which I'm familiar with now thanks to your audit, and I've had to go look for some of these contracts. It seems like there's some easy roadblocks that could be removed to government transparency, especially in an era where data visualization has never been easier. Yeah, it's very easy to create charts and graphs and public transparency websites, but there's just none of that's happening, and there doesn't seem to be an impulse for that on really either side of the legislature right now. Yeah, and that's that is true, and I think some of it's just prioritization, where you're willing to put resources into, and that changes from administration to administration, and it's like there's a pending piece of legislation right now. In fact, I'm going to go over to the State and Local Government Committee and we're done here and probably talk about it. It's called an Act to Audit All State Agencies, except it's not actually, and this is another issue where the Maine Wires report, who actually has been very helpful to us, is getting people to ask these questions so we can talk about it. I can talk about auditing all day long, and they're on their phones scrolling, man. They're not paying attention to anything I'm saying because it's not relevant. And it's like when you talk about the legislative process to school kids, it's not relevant until, and then, when I was Secretary of State, I remember there was the Driver Education Association, and there had been some serious changes to the driver ed laws, and I went to speak at their event. They're all sitting on the edges of their seats because this was now relevant to them. How do I get on that mailing list? And so that's is it relevant to people? And that's always the tough question. When I was taking all my classes, and my tutor was reflecting upon the annual comprehensive financial report and the single audit report, like that thick, he said, all this work that goes into this, does anybody even really look at it? And Steve Robinson looks at it, and that's really, really good. It's powerful. But as I try to explain this sort of thing to committees, about the work we do and the importance of it, this is where this type of exposure has been incredibly helpful for us. Not to elevate the office. The office is the office. The work is the work. And I've cautioned people. It's like, look, you want to know about the administration of the Office of State Procurement Services, you need to talk to them. We just did the audit. I can't speak to how they do their work. We can only tell you what we saw. It's like we tell people, we don't fix storm damage. We tell people what the weather is. There's a difference. So in terms of how the transparency of all this, how to make it better, it seems like almost an impossible task. I mean, the figure I threw out about the first year's expenditures, government is very different now than it was in 1820. Certainly when many times I've shown school kids around the State House. And one of the things that I have always said is that at one time, all of state government was in that building. I didn't really know what I was saying, except that it was true. Well, I was under fire, when I got elected auditor. And somebody saying, why? And a couple of newspapers have this real thing about legislative elections anyway. And I was like, okay, when was it changed to a legislative election? I stumbled into this treasure trove of information. So, all of state government was in the building.
there were no executive departments. The governor was the executive. And organically, as time moved by and things became more sophisticated, the legislature would set up commissions, like the Health Commission, the Road Commission, whatever, and they would put the appointments in. The governor had no control over the executive functions of government. So they impaneled a select committee, the Joint Select Committee on Administrative Code, which ultimately recommended a bunch of things, including nominated commissioners confirmed by the legislature overseeing state agencies. Administration and finance was one of the first ones set up. Also, the state auditor is going to have a much more complicated job. It's going to need, much more knowledge. They should be elected by the legislature, as are the constitutional officers. And this is in the 1930s. It's like, who knew, up until the 50s, most of our revenues came from things like state property taxes and liquor revenues, right? It was actually a Republican legislature under the leadership of a Republican governor, don't flinch, that set up the sales tax.
I'm unaffiliated.
But, that because they needed to help war widows and fund schools and things like that. And then the income tax came along. Part of the legislative record, we need to pass this as an emergency so it's not subject to a people's veto referendum.
Solomon Millett, I think, voted for the income tax.
Yeah, he's been around long enough.
Mm-hmm.
So things have changed dramatically, and we didn't hit $1 billion in state expenditures until the late 80s. And government continues to change. Some say for the better, others not. So, but nonetheless, whether it's under $1,400 or $11.5 billion, it's still public money. And our charge is to make sure it's being done with as the policymakers who make these decisions prescribe it.
So you mentioned earlier your resignation from SAM when the bear baiting thing came up, and something you said I thought was particularly, poignant or thoughtful, because you don't really hear a lot about this, but caring about what the average voter thinks, even if they're not aligned with you politically.
Yeah.
And I apply that to the issue with the integrity of our elections, which is also another area which you've got deep experience with. Voter ID referendum is going to be coming up this fall, and there's a lot of questions about non-citizen voting and the integrity of our elections. And there seems to be, there's a lot of people who are concerned about this.
Yeah.
Do you think that I guess if you're taking this attitude that you have of, be cognizant of how people feel, address their concerns,
sure,
so that there's no appearance of impropriety, with something like voter ID, where the critics say, well, it's not going to change anything because no one's voting who shouldn't be. Well, okay, then just pass it. What's the downside, right? I guess would be an argument that somebody would make. If you really believe that there's no non-citizens voting, you shouldn't have an issue with the SAVE Act, which Congressman Golden voted for, and Shelley Pingree says is going to stop married women from being able to vote if they haven't changed their name or something like that. So I guess in that, with that as a rambling preamble, what do you think about the voter ID, the SAVE Act, non-citizen voting? Do you think that, I guess your party, the Democrats, are being a little bit too dismissive of the suspicions that some people have about the integrity of our elections?
Well, there's nothing wrong with the rule, first of all. There's nothing wrong with voter ID. Where voter ID finds flaws is what is behind it. How do you obtain that ID? What type of ID do you accept? And that's where things get a little bit dodgy. And I would tell people, when I was as the chief motor vehicle officer, not elections officer, when they were talking about real ID, many states followed suit along the lines of real ID, and it was a front page New York Times headline: "The fellow that lost a leg in the Battle of the Bulge from West Virginia, who could not renew his driver's license because he couldn't prove he was a citizen. He was born in a cabin in the hills." And as we got into that, the Real ID Act was very ambitious at the outset. It called for a national hub, kind of like the AMBA hub that we use for registrations and license status. So if you get a drunk driving conviction in Montana, you just can't come to Maine and get a license. We check throughout the entire hub. And they envisioned something similar with Real ID, that we'd be able to verify the authenticity of things like birth certificates. Ho, ho, ho. Birth certificates exist in like 10,000 different formats, very different issuing authorities. Sometimes it was a town, sometimes it was the hospital or the doctor, sometimes they weren't issued at all. under Real ID, anyone born before 1936 was exempted because if you came into the country as a minor child, you were automatically a citizen. There was no paperwork. So a lot of problems with that. And you have people who are in nursing homes who don't have ID. Or people who move a lot. Or what is it only like a state ID? People who come across the border and decide I'm going to live in Maine, they declare their residency by registering to vote, right? That's the court decision Sanders v. Getchell, which was the whole college student thing, where a college student at Colby College was denied the ability to vote in Waterville. They said, well, you don't live here. And the Supreme Court said that one way to establish residency is to register to vote. And residency means a lot of different things for different purposes. It gets very involved and very complex. To the point of the Democrats, and I was chief elections administrator for 14 years, true voter fraud is vanishingly rare. We only prosecuted one case of actual substantiated fraud in the 14 years I was there, running at least 2 statewide elections a year with millions of ballots cast. And the reason for that, I think we sometimes underestimate our fellow citizens. They're actually mostly law-abiding people that want to do the right thing. Where we find variances, they're usually mistakes that people didn't know what they were doing. There was no point to prosecute because you couldn't prove intent. Somebody moves from town A to town B, they get their town paperwork, somebody hands them an absentee ballot application, they fill it out, the ballot's different names than the one they've already voted. They don't realize they're voting twice. That's happened a couple of times. Or we dealt with a mother whose kids went skiing in Colorado and they had to get the absentee ballot. I just called them on the phone, marked their ballots accordingly, signed the names. It's like, wow, that's 2 felonies. Mm-hmm. You can't mark another person's ballot, you can't sign their envelopes. It's some pretty stern conversations about that. Was it actually criminal in the objective point? No, but was to the letter of the law. So, I think the devil is in the details on voter ID, not necessarily the policy. You have to prove identity in order to register. And you have to prove proof of residency in order to register. Now, you've got a state ID that has 123 Wagon Wheel Lane. It does both, right? So you only need that one document. But if you don't have that document, well, then you have other things you can use. You can use things like, a fishing license or a utility bill, a military ID.
You only have to attest to your citizenship, though, right?
That is an affirmation, correct. Yeah. You check a box. If that is not true and you are not a citizen and you willfully attempt to register and vote, the penalty runs as follows. You go to jail, it's a felony, and then you are deported and you can never apply for citizenship.
And who's checking on those affirmations to make sure they're accurate?
Well, there is a lot of post-election cleanup that happens that the public does not see. Everything is reconciled after the election. So do you prevent it necessarily? Probably not. If there is a question in the outcome of an election, a 1-vote margin, and it's questionable whether someone who voted by absentee was actually a citizen or not. That's what the lawyers figure out, and that's what if it's a legislative race, the legislature figures out as to whether or not to maybe call for a new election. So there are many, many safeguards there. I've heard allegations that people bring in busloads of college kids to register and vote. Like, we're not going to catch that.
Well, they're coming from the campus, certainly. When I was at Bowdoin, they had the Brunswick town clerk came into the student union during the gay marriage referendum and took ballots there. And there were, students walking up and down lines of waiting students to vote, saying yes on 1, no on 2, yes on 3. That's electioneering. It should be a crime, but they're all legal votes because they've registered to vote and they live in Brunswick. They live in the state of Maine. I think probably people in northern Maine would get a little heartburn over that idea. But I guess speaking more about the Secretary of State and the voting issue, in this most recent election in 2024 at the legislative level, the Uwakava votes played an unusual role in that there were more of them than there's ever been, and it just worked out that they were swing votes in a lot of legislative districts. If you take Uwakava out of the picture entirely or you bring it back to levels that it had been in previous years, you probably have Republicans in control of the House, maybe. I don't know exactly how the numbers play out. But in looking at the Uwakava votes, one, I'd be interested to know your take on why do you think that there were more in 2024 than there had ever been? And at a more detailed level, there was an individual that we looked into who voted in Windham who last lived in Maine when he was 8, and had lived in Denmark ever since.
Yep.
And registered to vote, and so he's a U.S. citizen, but he's never had a job in Maine. He's never had an address. He's never paid taxes. So I think most people would say, like, well, I mean, this guy, he's clearly happy in Denmark. Like, he's not. It doesn't sound like he's coming back to Maine. So why is he voting in Windham school board races? And apart from the legality of it, I mean, I think there's also a moral aspect to whether or not that individual should be voting in Maine elections if he's never going to be paying the taxes for it. So I guess the question is, why was UOCAVA so high in your opinion? And do you think that the state should be endeavoring to find eligible but unregistered voters like this guy in Denmark, getting them registered and getting a ballot in their hands and making it as easy as possible for them to vote by phone or email?
Yeah, so first of all, we don't talk about registered voters. We talk about voter age eligible because we have election day registration. So people can register up to and including election day. I think in terms of the turnout for 24 presidential election years are always our highest turnouts. The increase in the use of the absentee ballot has followed a straight up trajectory since UOCAVA was passed in the 70s. The first time we used absentee balloting in this country was in 1864 during the presidential election, because you had all those people who were in the field fighting the war who were able to vote because of that congressional action. By and large, elections are managed by states, not by the federal government, although the federal government does have some pretty strong influence, like things like UOCAVA, the Uniformed and Overseas Citizen Absentee Voting Act.
That's
for
pretty
those
good.
who don't do the acronym, and the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act, which actually made it that much easier. I was on the board of directors of an organization now called U.S. Vote, but at the time it was called the Overseas Vote Foundation. And I became acquainted with them. Their executive director was a woman who sent her kids to summer camp in Maine. She was an American citizen. She lived in Munich. Her name was Susan Jazycka-Sweenot. Don't ask me to spell it. And I met her at an ASK conference, and I quickly learned to avoid her because she was so intense. She would stand on your foot and talk to you about the problems that American citizens, including service people, face overseas. And then I was out of office, and I was still in office. I had a former legislator who was teaching English in Pakistan, and reached out to me the day before the election. It's like, look, she knew the drill. She had ordered her absentee ballot 90 days in advance. It had shown up in Pakistan the day before the election. How do I get this back? And we buzzed around with the Attorney General's office about it. Thought, okay, if you can get to Islamabad, get to the embassy, they have a secure fax and you can fax it to your town. Well, she's in a remote village 100 miles up a goat trail. There's no way that was going to happen. And that made me much more intensely interested in this process. And then I started looking for Susan at conferences. And I was on their board when I was out of office. And you talk about military voters. Like you have a voting assistance officer on a guided missile destroyer. And they have to keep all the notebooks for all the election laws in all 50 states and the territories because they have people from everywhere on these ships. And it's almost impossible for people to vote, because there's a paper ballot. They might get mail every 3 months. And the MOVE Act really made that easier. And I think this is a long answer to a short question. Part of it was the presidential cycle, and also part of it is greater familiarity with that process and more accessibility to it that has gotten more expats involved in the process. Now, the fellow who hasn't lived in Windham since 8, still an American citizen, and that's where we would say he would vote. That's where he last was domiciled. So people may have arguments about the school budget, whatever, but those bedrock principles still apply. I mean, he's an American citizen. That's where he last lived. That's where he gets to vote. Felon voting works the same way. When we have incarcerated felons, they don't vote at Warren. They vote in where they lived before.
Be an interesting legislative district if they did.
Oh, well, and I would go down there to help update voter registrations. And some of these guys are wicked humble. They're just glad that anybody cares enough about them to do this kind of work. And I'd have my laptop and have the voter file open, and it's like, okay, Steve, where did you live? And say something like 1184, Peachtree Lane. And it's like, well, I have you at 284. It's like, man, I'm sorry. I've been here so long, I forget where I lived, and the place may be gone. I mean, they may have bulldozed it and put a parking lot in or an Irving Quick Stop. But that's where they vote, and they never lose their right to vote.
Well, one thing we haven't talked about yet is if you do run for Congress, your Republican opponent right now, it looks like, would be former Governor Paul LePage.
Yeah.
Who I think you know. I think you have some experience with Governor LePage.
A little bit, yeah.
I think you were briefly out of office and working with Sam because Charlie Summers came in as the Secretary of State.
Charlie and I are still very good friends.
During the Tea Party wave that swept Governor LePage into office. But then you came back eventually. The tide receded. What do you think the dynamics of running a congressional campaign against Governor LePage would be?
Well, I think people know Governor LePage very well. They know his history. They know me pretty well. Probably not as well as they know Governor LePage.
I think he's been in the newspapers a little bit more.
A little bit more. But I would say he's arguably one of the smartest people to ever hold that job. His drawback was he was so bitterly partisan. And I was overseas. I went to Taiwan, and part of what we did, we met with trade representatives. And the states tried this. We hire somebody, send them over to Europe, set up an office, try to get deals, exchange deals, export deals, and it always would fall short. We've spent a ton of money. Well, the new model is you don't set up an office. You hire someone who's already doing it and is there, right? And a lot of states and even cities have trade representatives who are very effective. And so I come home and I happened to run into the governor and I said, this is a great idea. And his response was, well, if the Democrats would work with me on taxes and then we could do this other stuff. It's like completely dismissive. And I was disappointed by that. And so, and I think that was something that held him back a little bit, was always fighting the Democrats, instead of where do we find common ground? And I'm not telling secrets. We all watched it for 8 years. At one point, he got so mad at the legislature, he vetoed every single bill that hit his desk.
It was a great moment.
Yeah, so, and of course those vetoes were overturned at a wholesale rate. But, so like I say, people know the governor well. They know me pretty well. I mean, I've been around now for 30 years, and I have been surprised at the response I've gotten, certainly from Democrats, but even from many Republicans and independents who are conservatives. Because of my work as an elections official, as a motor vehicle official, as a state representative, I've always been nonpartisan in my work. You're always going to have that party line vote. But, I've always, like when I was Secretary of State and we had to make a decision about accepting late petition signatures on the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, Democrats were very angry with me. And I said, look, policy is your job. My job is ensuring that the voter is heard. And those little old ladies who circulated that petition at a county fair in faith that they were going to be heard deserve to be heard. And, that it wound up not being a successful initiative. The voters were the ones that had the last say, not the Secretary of State. And I always felt that, in my work, that no person in a town should be punished by me because their state representative is a Republican. That's just not moral. So, I think people know my work and they trust me. So if it happens that we get into a year from now and it's Governor LePage and I facing off, I think we'll have some interesting debates.
All right, I'll give you an easy one for the last question. Should we take out all of the dams and the rivers to bring back the salmon fisheries?
I think climate change has made that almost academic. I was part of the river restoration project up on the Penobscot River, and we did remove a lot of dams. But there's been some paleobiological research to show that salmon have only really been coming to the Maine rivers for just a few hundred years. It was actually too cold prior to that. And it's like lobsters. Lobsters depend on very, very cold water, and they seem to be migrating further north. I haven't thrown in the towel on the Atlantic salmon, but I don't think we get enough out of hydropower to make new dams worthwhile. But I don't know that. I think we're at a point now where tearing out all the dams would only offer us a diminishing return on the return of the Atlantic salmon. The trap counts in the Penobscot are still very, very low. I saw the trap counts for the Narragansett River. How many shad, how many salmon? Well, 0 and 0. Yeah, it's early in the season, but after all the work we've done, that's very discouraging.
Well, Matt Dunlap, thank you very much for coming in and talking with me. I really appreciate it. We'll have to do this again after you declare as a congressional candidate.
There you go. All right, thank you.
Thanks.